She thought she could use the HOA to crush her neighbors with a noise complaint. What she didn't know, I'm the HOA's lawyer, and when she crossed the line, she started a war she couldn't control. This story has secret surveillance, late-night threats, and a plot to take me down in my own neighborhood. Before we jump in, smash that like button, hit subscribe so you don't miss the twists, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story reaches. I was halfway through drafting an email to a client when the knock came at my office door, not the polite tap of someone with manners. It was the sharp, impatient rapping of someone who believed their time was worth more than mine. I opened it to find Karen Miller, our HOA's most persistent complainer, already pushing her way in. She didn't wait for an invitation. Her eyes were narrowed, and her mouth was tight like she'd been rehearsing this confrontation all morning. She dropped a folder thick with papers onto my desk, sending my coffee sloshing dangerously close to my keyboard. I asked what this was about, though I already suspected. Karen never visited without a grievance. She straightened her shoulders like she was about to deliver breaking news. "It's a noise complaint," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry into the hallway. The Hendersons across from her had apparently been blasting music every evening for the past 2 weeks. I asked her if she'd spoken to them directly. She said of course not. That wasn't her job. Her job, apparently, was to run straight to the HOA board with every minor disturbance. I skimmed the first page and frowned. She'd dated every incident down to the minute, each with dramatic descriptions like ear-shattering and borderline harassment. It was the kind of exaggeration I'd seen her use before. But this time she'd gone further. She'd included photographs of their porch, their car, even a shot through their front window showing the outline of someone holding a guitar. I told her we couldn't use photos taken inside someone's home without permission. She gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes and said she wasn't here to discuss the rules. She was here to make sure we enforced them. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to let this one slide. I could feel the old frustration rising in me. Karen had filed complaints against half the neighborhood over the years. Barking dogs, overgrown lawns, kids riding bikes too fast, barbecue smoke drifting in her direction. Most people just tolerated her or tried to keep their heads down. But she'd picked the wrong person to push this time. I reminded her, calmly, that the HOA's charter had specific procedures for noise disputes, starting with informal mediation between neighbors. She waved her hand, like she was brushing away a fly. She said she'd already sent emails to every board member and expected action within the week. That was when I leaned back in my chair and asked if she was aware that I was the HOA's legal counsel. Her eyebrows twitched just slightly, the first crack in her confident posture. She muttered something about not knowing that was relevant. "Oh, it's relevant," I told her. "Very relevant." I explained that as the HOA's lawyer, I wasn't just here to process her complaint. I was here to make sure the HOA followed the law, and the law frowned upon baseless harassment of residents. Her lips tightened again, but she didn't back down. She said she had every right to peace and quiet in her own home. I agreed she did, but peace and quiet didn't mean policing every sound within 100 yards. I told her if she wanted the HOA to pursue this, we'd have to open an investigation, interview both parties, and review any legitimate evidence. I emphasized, legitimate. She didn't like that word. She gathered her papers in a huff and said she'd be expecting my report. As soon as she left, I sat back and let out a long breath. It wasn't just about the Hendersons anymore. It was about drawing a line. People like Karen thrived when no one challenged them. They wielded the HOA's rules like weapons, counting on everyone else's reluctance to make a fuss. I decided then that I was going to follow this one all the way through. No shortcuts, no compromises. That evening I drove past her house on my way home. Curtains drawn, porch light on, everything looking perfectly ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was already planning her next move. The Hendersons' house was across the street, and I could see faint light in the living room. No music, no shouting, nothing unusual. I almost laughed. If Karen thought this was a major disturbance, she'd have a heart attack living anywhere else in the city. The next day I called the Hendersons to set up a meeting. They were surprised to hear from me, but agreed to talk. When I arrived, they welcomed me in with polite smiles. Mr. Henderson was in his late 40s, soft-spoken, with the kind of calm that made you lean in to hear him. His wife seemed more guarded, but she didn't interrupt. I explained Karen's complaint and asked for their side. They exchanged a look before Mr. Henderson said they'd been practicing music in the evenings, yes, but always at a reasonable volume. They'd even tested it by standing outside their own front door and could barely hear it. Mrs. Henderson added that Karen had never approached them about it directly, but they'd caught her taking pictures through their window one night. That got my attention. I asked if they had any proof. They did. A security camera on their porch had captured Karen walking across their lawn with her phone raised toward their living room. I asked if they'd be willing to share the footage. They didn't hesitate. As I watched the grainy video, my decision hardened. This wasn't just about noise anymore. Karen had crossed into invasion of privacy, and that was a problem. On my way back to the office, I called the HOA president. I told him we had a situation that needed careful handling. He sighed like he'd been expecting this. Karen was a thorn in his side too, but he admitted the board had always preferred to pacify her rather than confront her. I told him that was a mistake. The board couldn't allow one resident to misuse the HOA's authority to target others. He agreed, reluctantly, to let me take the lead. I started drafting a formal notice to Karen. Not the kind she was expecting. This one cited HOA bylaws about harassment and invasion of privacy. It outlined the steps the HOA could take if a member was found to be engaging in such behavior, including fines and possible suspension of certain privileges. By the time I finished, the letter was sharp enough to cut through her self-righteousness but measured enough to hold up in any legal review. I set it aside for the board's approval, knowing it was going to stir up a storm. That night I sat on my porch, listening to the soft hum of distant traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. Normal neighborhood sounds, the kind you stop noticing after a while. And I thought about Karen, probably sitting in her house with a glass of wine, convinced she'd forced the HOA to act on her latest crusade. She had no idea what was coming. Not yet. The board approved my letter without changing a single word, which told me two things. First, they were tired of Karen's antics, and second, they were more than happy to let me take the heat when she inevitably exploded over it. I printed the notice on HOA letterhead, sealed it in an envelope, and walked it over to her house myself. She opened the door after the second knock, wearing a floral robe and an expression that flickered from surprise to suspicion the moment she saw me. I handed her the envelope and told her it was an official response to her recent complaint. She started to open it right there, but I told her it would be better to read it privately. That was partly for her dignity and partly because I didn't want to be standing on her porch when her face went from smug to outraged. She narrowed her eyes like she could sense there was something in those pages she wouldn't like. I wished her a good afternoon and walked away without another word. Halfway back to my place, I heard her voice calling after me, but I kept going. I knew the letter would do its work soon enough. By the next morning, she had left 3 voicemails and 2 emails, each one more heated than the last. She accused me of overstepping my role, of targeting her unfairly, and of siding with the Hendersons because I probably played in a band once too. That last part almost made me laugh, but I didn't reply. Instead, I focused on the next step, which was arranging the mediation meeting. HOA rules required it, and I intended to follow the process to the letter. I scheduled it for Thursday evening in the small conference room by the community pool. Neutral ground and public enough to discourage theatrics. I called both parties to confirm. The Hendersons agreed immediately. Karen tried to insist on a private meeting with the board, but I told her this was the standard procedure. She finally relented, though I could hear the icy edge in her voice. On the day of the meeting, I arrived early to set up. I placed 3 chairs on each side of the table with a small stack of printed agendas in the middle. I also brought my laptop so I could take notes in real time. The Hendersons arrived first, looking calm but cautious. Karen swept in 5 minutes later with a leather-bound notebook and a manila folder bulging with papers. She sat down without greeting anyone and began tapping her pen against the table. I opened the meeting by explaining the process. Each side would present their account without interruption, then we would discuss possible resolutions. Karen insisted on going first. She launched into a long dramatic monologue about her right to peaceful enjoyment and how the Hendersons' music sessions had ruined her evenings. She spoke of migraines, sleepless nights, and a general decline in her quality of life. I asked her to keep her statements factual, and she handed me several pages of what she called her noise diary. Every entry was written in capital letters with descriptions like unbearable guitar solo and vibrations through the walls. When she finished, I turned to the Hendersons. Mr. Henderson spoke first, calmly explaining that they played music for no more than an hour each evening and always at a reasonable volume. He pointed out that no other neighbors had complained. Then he mentioned the security camera footage. Karen froze for a split second before saying it was a lie. I asked if they had the video available. They did. I set up my laptop so everyone could see the screen. The footage played, showing Karen walking across the Hendersons' lawn holding her phone toward their living room window. She lingered there for several seconds, then walked away. The silence in the room was heavy. Karen tried to claim she had been photographing their porch for evidence, but I reminded her that entering someone's property without permission was trespassing, and photographing inside their home was a serious violation of privacy. Her face reddened, but she didn't deny it again. I steered the meeting toward solutions. The Hendersons said they were willing to adjust their practice times if it would help, but they would not stop playing music entirely. I said that seemed reasonable, and suggested they limit sessions to before 9 p.m. Karen crossed her arms and muttered that it wouldn't make a difference. I told her the HOA could not restrict normal residential activities that didn't violate our noise ordinances, and that her own actions might be subject to review. That last part made her snap her notebook shut and glare at me like I had just betrayed her deepest trust. The meeting ended without a handshake. The Hendersons thanked me and left. Karen lingered just long enough to tell me she wasn't done fighting. I told her she had every right to follow the appeals process, but reminded her that all future communications should go through the HOA office. She spun on her heel and left without another word. That night I received a text from an unknown number with a single sentence: "I know what you're doing." No name, no punctuation. I didn't reply, but I saved the number. Something told me Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. The next morning, my neighbor Dan stopped me while I was getting the mail. He asked if I had heard about Karen's latest. Apparently, she had been going door to door telling people the HOA was covering up noise violations and that I was in on it. I thanked him for the heads up and made a mental note to address it at the next board meeting. False accusations against the HOA's attorney were no small matter. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes. A car idling at the end of my street late at night. An unfamiliar figure walking past my house more than once in the same evening. It could have been nothing, but my instinct said otherwise. When you've practiced law as long as I have, you learn to trust those instincts. I started keeping my porch light on all night and made sure my home security cameras were recording. If Karen was planning to push this into personal territory, I wanted to be ready. By Friday, I had compiled all the evidence from the meeting and sent it to the board with my recommendation. We should issue Karen a formal warning for harassment and invasion of privacy. I knew it would provoke her, but letting it slide would set a dangerous precedent. The board agreed unanimously. The warning letter went out that afternoon. At sunset, I saw Karen in her driveway talking to two other neighbors. She caught sight of me and smiled in a way that wasn't friendly. I realized then that this wasn't going to be over in a week. Karen wasn't just filing a complaint anymore. She was building a campaign. And campaigns have a way of getting ugly fast. Saturday started like a calm surface that looked safe enough to step onto, until I realized the water was moving fast underneath. I brewed coffee, sat on the porch, and watched the morning light creep across the cul-de-sac while a sprinkler ticked away on someone's lawn. My phone buzzed with 3 new emails from neighbors forwarding me a post from the community forum. Karen had written a long message accusing the HOA of protecting repeat offenders and naming the Hendersons as the reason she could not sleep. She mentioned me by name, suggested I lacked impartiality, and added a line that said she had spoken to outside authorities who were prepared to escalate. I read it twice, not because I believed a word of it, but because I wanted the shape of her strategy. She was trying to make this bigger than a complaint. She wanted a movement, and she wanted a villain. I answered with a crisp statement from the HOA account that explained the process and reminded everyone about mediation privacy and the prohibition on doxing neighbors. I kept my tone steady. I did not mention the warning we had issued to her, since that was a board matter. I did not step into the mud. I pressed send and let the statement sit. The right people read it, and the right people stayed calm. By midday, the rumor shifted from digital to face-to-face. The community had a cleanup event at the park, and I went partly to help, partly because visibility matters when the air turns charged. I pulled weeds with Dan, who gave me a look that said he had news. He whispered that Karen was collecting signatures to force a special session and demand stricter noise rules. She was telling people the Hendersons were not just playing music but hosting small concerts. He rolled his eyes. I thanked him, kept pulling weeds, and waited for the moment when I would stop being a neighbor with gloves and become the lawyer again. It took 8 minutes. Karen arrived with a stack of papers and a bright smile that did not touch her eyes. She moved from person to person with the confidence of someone who expected this to be easy. When she reached me, she paused as if deciding whether to pitch the script or pick the fight. She chose the script. She asked if I cared about peace in the neighborhood, then pressed a clipboard into my hand. I looked at the printed language. It promised quiet hours stricter than our city code and fines that started high and doubled on every citation. I asked if she had read the bylaws that required a membership vote and a detailed notice period before any change like this. She said the community had a right to act when the board failed. I told her, this is the board acting, since the board is made up of the community. Her smile thinned. She tried to speak but stopped herself and moved on. I did not follow. There is a difference between blocking someone and letting them set their own trap. Back home, I found a letter in my mailbox from the city code office stamped with a bright red notice. An anonymous complaint had accused me of property maintenance violations and running a home business without a permit. I laughed once, then scanned the letter into my case file. Retaliation is ugly but predictable. I called the number listed for the inspector and asked to schedule a visit at soonest availability. He arrived within 2 hours, a tall guy with patient eyes who had seen this kind of thing 100 times. We walked the yard together. He shook his head at the neat fence, the trimmed shrubs, the clear path to the front door. No violations here. He asked about the home business allegation. I told him I am an attorney, and I do work from my home office sometimes, which is allowed under our zoning and under state law, as long as there are no signs, customers, or noise. He looked around at the quiet street and smiled. He said he would close the complaint as unfounded, and noted the file appeared to be part of a neighborhood dispute. He advised me to document everything, including that he had told me this. I thanked him and offered him water, which he took before heading back to his truck. While the house settled around me, I opened a fresh page in my notes and wrote out the timeline of Karen's actions. Noise diary, trespass, mediation, warning, forum post, petition, anonymous complaint to the city. I felt the shape of a bigger motive nudging at the edge. People do not escalate this fast unless they get something out of it. Money, control, or both. I pulled up a browser and started searching for short-term rental listings near our street. I filtered by amenities and layout. I looked at headboards on beds, the color of towels, the grain of kitchen counters. Most hosts try to make a place look unique, but patterns show through. My breath caught when I saw a listing under a first name with no last initial and a profile photo of a hiking trail. The living room in the photos had the same window grid as Karen's house and a ceramic lamp I had seen through her blinds. The porch rail in one picture had a distinctive knot in the wood that matched a spot I had passed every day. She was renting a guest suite under the radar. The calendar showed high occupancy. The reviews used words like peaceful and quiet multiple times. The last thing she needed was a guitar drifting across the street. I saved the pages and captured the photos, then checked our HOA rules about rentals. We allowed them if the host registered with the board, disclosed occupancy limits, and agreed to certain conditions. Karen had never registered. My jaw tightened. It explained her campaign without excusing it. It gave me leverage with care. The goal was not to crush her. The goal was to stop the harm and restore sanity without tearing the street into factions. I drafted a memo to the board laying out the probable violation and suggested we request clarification from her in writing. We would not accuse. We would ask for compliance and a meeting. I added that we should also offer voluntary sound mitigation grants to any resident with reasonable concerns. It is easier to calm a neighborhood with help than with rules. Before I could send the memo, my phone buzzed again with that same unknown number. The message said, "Watch your step counselor." A minute later, a short video came through. It showed my porch late at night, from a low angle near my side yard. I watched myself walk out to lock the door and pause at the stairs. You could see my face clearly. Whoever shot it had been on my property. I replayed the clip until the frame caught a partial shoe and a glimpse of denim. It was not proof of identity, but it was proof of proximity. I saved the video, then forwarded it to a drive I keep for any case that could turn into litigation. I called the non-emergency line and asked to file a report for trespassing and harassment. I did not accuse a name. I provided the dates, the texts, the video, and the city complaint. The officer on the line took it all without drama and told me a patrol car would swing by tonight. He said visibility sometimes keeps things from getting worse. I thanked him and closed my laptop with steady hands that did not feel steady. That evening I walked over to the Hendersons to check on them. They had seen the forum thread and looked tired but not defeated. Mr. Henderson said he was thinking of installing a bit of soundproofing in the front room anyway. He loves to play, he said, but he loves keeping peace more. I told him I respected that and proposed the idea of a small HOA grant for the materials. He blinked in surprise, then smiled. He said that gesture would go a long way. Mrs. Henderson brewed tea and asked if things were going to get worse before they got better. I said it might. I told them about the plan to reach out to Karen for rental compliance without accusation. They nodded. They wanted this to end without anyone getting hurt. Me too. When I stepped back outside, the air felt heavy with summer heat even though the sun had dropped. I walked past Karen's driveway and saw two figures near her garage. They stopped when they noticed me, then pretended to check a box of flyers. I could see the word quiet in bold letters on the top page. They started down the sidewalk and slipped one under a wiper on a car, then into a mailbox, which is a federal offense, but I let it slide for the moment. Picking every fight is a way to lose all of them. I took a photo of the flyer where it had been tucked on my neighbor's windshield, then kept moving. When I reached my house, I checked the cameras again. An alert popped up from the night before. A second angle I had missed showed the person in my side yard pausing like they were thinking about the best angle. No face. A hoodie. A flash of a watch. I added the clip to the report file. Then I turned on both porch lights and went inside. The board met over video at 9. I presented the memo slowly and plainly. I showed the listing screenshots and the policy language. I asked for permission to send a notice, asking Karen to clarify whether she was operating a rental, and if so, to register immediately to bring it into compliance. I recommended we pair the notice with the sound mitigation grant announcement, so no one could say we were singling her out. The president nodded. Two members looked wary but agreed that avoiding a direct confrontation while insisting on rules was the best path. We voted yes. I drafted the letters while the call was still open and sent them for sign-off. The president asked if I felt safe. I told him I had taken steps and that a patrol would pass by tonight. He said to keep the board updated and thanked me for staying level. I logged off and sat in the quiet for a few seconds, breathing and listening to my house. Near midnight, the patrol car rolled down the block and paused in front of my place. The officer flashed the spotlight across the hedges, then drove slowly to the corner and back. I watched from the upstairs window with the lights off. When he left, I returned to my desk and wrote up the day in a narrative that would hold in court if it came to that. The habit has saved me more than once. Halfway through the final paragraph, I heard a dull thud from outside, followed by the sharp sound of glass. I grabbed my phone and stepped to the window. Across the street, the Hendersons' front window had a hole in the corner and a spider web of cracks spreading out. A small rock lay on the path below it. Lights came on inside. I was already dialing. The dispatcher took my location clearly. I said there had been an act of vandalism and that it was linked to an ongoing dispute documented with the HOA. I pulled on shoes and went out as the Hendersons opened their door. Mr. Henderson held up a hand and said they were okay. His voice shook. Mrs. Henderson stood behind him, and I saw fear in her eyes that made my chest tighten. I told them to stay inside until the officer arrived. Then I turned slowly and looked down the street. A figure stood in the shadow of a tree a block away. I called out that the police were on their way. The figure did not move, then slipped behind the tree and vanished. I did not chase. I waited with the Hendersons until the cruiser pulled up. The officer walked the scene, took photos, collected the rock with careful hands, and wrote down everything we told him. I added that we had just voted to ask a resident to bring a rental into compliance and to offer sound mitigation funds. He listened like he understood the subtext without needing us to say the name. He asked if we felt comfortable staying here tonight. We said we did. The cruiser stayed for another 15 minutes, then made another slow pass of the street. When the lights faded, I stood with the Hendersons on the porch and told them I would file an incident update with the board and that I would ensure repairs were covered by the HOA Community Damage Fund. They thanked me with small, tired smiles and went inside. I walked home feeling the moment settle on my shoulders. This stopped being a nuisance and turned into a test of whether a neighborhood can hold together. On my doorstep, I found a flyer tucked into my mat. The top line said, "Protect our peace," in oversized type. The second line said, "Project Quiet starts now," and included a link to a survey that asked residents to rate the worst offenders on the block. I felt the tug of anger and let it pass. I took a photo for the record, then slipped it into a folder. Back inside, I sent the rental compliance letter and the grant announcement to Karen's email and physical address through certified mail. I looked at the clock. It read 1:30. I locked the doors and walked from room to room until everything felt in order. My phone buzzed again. A final message from the unknown number. TikTok counselor. I sat down, placed the phone on the desk and wrote one line in my notes. A countdown belongs to someone who thinks they are winning. Then I closed my eyes for a moment and pictured the knot in the porch rail from the listing photo. Proof sits in plain sight if you believe you will find it. In the morning I would gather it and make the case that could end this. Tonight I would trust the quiet and let the street breathe. Sunday morning I woke to the sound of footsteps on gravel. Not hurried, not sneaky, just slow and deliberate, like someone wanted me to hear them. I slipped to the window and caught the edge of a blue hoodie moving past the hedge toward the sidewalk. My security alert pinged a second later with the motion clip. I saved it without hesitation. The image was partial again, but the posture and height looked familiar. I poured coffee and tried to shake the tension, but the taste felt sharp on my tongue. Outside the street looked ordinary. Sprinklers clicked. A neighbor walked a dog. But there was a current in the air now, one I could feel in my chest. I decided to use the morning for gathering proof. The listing with the knot in the porch rail was still active, and the calendar showed a new booking starting tomorrow. I drove by Karen's place slow enough to notice 2 suitcases in the front hall through the sidelight glass. The blinds were half drawn, but not enough to hide the detail. I kept moving, so there was no pause to catch attention. Back home, I pulled the short-term rental site up again and took time-stamped screen recordings of the listing, the reviews, and the booking calendar. Every click documented, every image saved. This was not about catching her in some petty rule break. This was about understanding why she was willing to drag the whole neighborhood into a fight over sound. She was protecting an income stream, and she thought fear would keep people from asking questions. I called the HOA president and explained what I had found. He didn't sound surprised. He said they'd had whispers about Karen running something on the side, but no one had proof. I told him we had it now. He asked if I wanted to push for enforcement immediately. I said no, not yet. We had to pair the enforcement with something the community could see as fair, so Karen couldn't spin it as a vendetta. That meant delivering the grant offer to everyone at the same time. He agreed and told me to draft a neutral notice for all residents that explained both programs without naming her. I could tell he was worried about the backlash, but he trusted my approach. At noon, I walked down to the Hendersons to check on their window. The temporary board was in place, and they'd scheduled a repair for Tuesday. Mrs. Henderson said they'd slept poorly. She kept glancing toward the street as if expecting another rock. I told them about the compliance letter and the grant notice going out this week. Mr. Henderson nodded slowly. He asked if I thought Karen was behind the vandalism. I said I didn't have proof and wouldn't accuse without it. But I also said this was the kind of moment where it's better to prepare than to hope. We talked about adding a second camera on their side yard. I told them the HOA would cover it. Back at my house, I reviewed the overnight patrol logs the officer had emailed me. They'd done 3 passes and noted no suspicious vehicles. Whoever had stood in that shadow on Friday knew when to move. That meant they'd been watching the patrol too. I filed that under intent. My phone buzzed again mid-afternoon with another message from the unknown number. This time it was a photo of my own mailbox with the flag up. I walked out to check and found nothing inside but the regular mail. I looked up and down the street, nothing out of place. It felt like a move meant to test how quickly I'd respond. I didn't give them the satisfaction of rushing. That evening, the board met again briefly to finalize the notices. I read the text aloud, making sure it stayed even and impersonal. The compliance letter simply reminded all owners of the rental policy and asked anyone operating without registration to contact the board within 10 days. The grant notice invited applications from any resident seeking to reduce sound transmission into or out of their home. We voted to approve both and scheduled delivery for Monday morning. I closed my laptop and sat in the quiet after the meeting ended. My mind kept running the angles. Karen was going to receive that letter in less than 24 hours. The moment she read it, the real escalation would start. Around 9, I took a walk to clear my head. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass. I passed the park and saw 2 of the flyer distributors from the night before tacking one to the bulletin board. They didn't notice me until I was a few steps away. One of them stiffened. I told them calmly that HOA rules required any public posting to carry the name and address of the sponsor. They didn't respond. I took a photo and kept walking. My voice stayed even, but inside I could feel the line tightening. Monday started with a sharp knock. It was the postal carrier with the certified letters for delivery. I watched him slide one into Karen's box and scan it. 10 seconds later, she stepped out in workout clothes and pulled it out. She glanced at the label, then ripped it open right there on the driveway. I couldn't hear her, but I saw her lips form a word I'd heard before in mediation. She crumpled the paper halfway, then smoothed it out and went back inside. An hour later, my email pinged with a message from her. The subject line read, "Retaliation." The body accused the board of singling her out because of her complaint about the Hendersons and claimed she would be contacting her attorney. I forwarded it to the president and replied briefly, stating the notice had gone to all residents. She didn't answer. By afternoon, the forum lit up again. An anonymous account posted that the HOA was trying to silence residents with bogus rule changes and hinted that my position as attorney was in jeopardy. Several neighbors pushed back asking for proof. The account didn't respond. I made a note to track the IP through our forum admin if the posts continued. At 4, the Hendersons called to say a car had slowed in front of their house twice in the past hour. They'd gotten the plate on the second pass. I told them to send it to me and I'd forward it to the officer handling the vandalism report. The plate came back, registered to a rental vehicle from the same company used in one of the reviews on Karen's listing. Not conclusive, but close enough to raise my pulse. That evening, I sat on my porch waiting for the patrol car to roll by. Instead, I saw Karen walk past on the opposite sidewalk with a small dog. She glanced at me once and kept moving. Half a block later, she stopped to talk to a couple unloading groceries. They looked over at me, mid-conversation. Karen gestured toward my house. The couple nodded slowly. I felt the message in that glance. She wasn't backing down. She was recruiting. After dark, I heard footsteps again. This time they came right up my driveway. My camera feed showed a person in a hoodie standing at the edge of my porch, out of reach of the motion light. They stayed there for 12 seconds, then walked back down and into the street. I called it in. The patrol arrived 5 minutes later, but the street was empty. The officer reviewed the footage and said he'd add it to the report. I thanked him and stayed on the porch until the car made its pass. Inside, I sat at the desk and laid out my files in order. Complaint, mediation, warning, forum activity, rental listing, compliance letter, harassment messages, trespass incidents, vandalism. I could feel the case taking shape like pieces locking together. This was no longer just a neighborhood dispute. It was targeted conduct that could meet the standard for legal action. I didn't want it to go there, but I was ready if it did. At 11, my phone buzzed again. No words this time, just another video. It was my porch from earlier that night, shot from the street. The focus lingered on my front door, then panned slowly up to the second-floor window where I was now standing. The message was clear. They wanted me to know they could see me. I saved the clip to the secure drive and shut the blinds. Then I sat in the dark for a long minute, listening to the silence. A silence that felt less like peace and more like the breath before the next step. The morning came slow, like it was thinking about whether to show up, and I let it because the night had been a tangle of half sleep and listening for footsteps that never came. I brewed coffee and opened my notebook to the page where I had drawn the line between firm and foolish. The notices had gone out. The forum had flared. The trespass had escalated into a kind of performance. Today needed a new move, one that kept me steady and left a trail any judge would respect if it came to that. I started with the forum. Overnight, the anonymous account had replied to questions by hinting at a list of offenders and a promise to publish addresses if the board refused to act. I screenshotted each post with timestamps and notified the admin to preserve server logs. Then I wrote a public note from the HOA stating that posting addresses or personal details would violate policy and could violate the law. I kept my tone clean and simple because soundbites travel faster than nuance. I pressed send and watched the thread quiet down like a crowd deciding whether to keep shouting or go home. Then I drove to the hardware store for materials that would not scare a neighborhood, but would help me sleep. I bought a brighter motion light for the side yard and a small camera with a wide lens. The cashier asked if I needed someone to carry the box, and my brain wrote a file note even as my mouth said no thanks. Back home, I installed the light by noon on a ladder that wobbled more than I liked. When the light finally snapped on the corner of the yard turned into day, I placed the camera near the hedge and angled it so it could see both the porch and the sidewalk where the hoodie had paused. I tested it twice. It captured a crisp image of my own puzzled face, which I decided to keep as proof that humor was still possible. The Hendersons texted that their window repair would arrive early afternoon and asked if I could stop by. I said yes and walked over with a folder for the claim form. The contractor had a calm way of moving that felt like medicine for the nerves. He took measurements and explained the laminated glass he would install. Mrs. Henderson listened with her hand on the back of a chair, like steadying herself with furniture might steady the whole house. I asked if they had seen any cars pause again. She said one slowed at midnight and then moved on when the patrol turned the corner. I told them I had installed a new light and that if the person came back we would see them. Mr. Henderson asked if I wanted help putting up a sign that said cameras in use. I told him not yet because sometimes a sign tells the wrong people where to look. He laughed quietly and said he understood. As I left, I spotted Karen coming down her driveway in a blazer with a folder under her arm. She saw me and offered a smile that had no warmth. She said she was on her way to meet her attorney. I said I hoped her attorney would advise her to comply with the rental policy and to stop the campaign that was targeting residents. She said she was only protecting the neighborhood. I said the neighborhood did not need protection from guitar practice. She looked past me at the boarded window across the street. She asked if the board planned to pay for that. I told her yes, and that we would be launching the sound mitigation grants this week. She tilted her head as if that proved her point. Then she walked to her car without another word. Back home, I drafted the claim approval for the Hendersons and sent it to the treasurer with a note to prioritize payment. I wanted our response to feel immediate, because fear grows in the spaces where people wait. Then I put on my suit for the afternoon board work session. We met in the small community room where the air always smells a little like chlorine from the pool and paper from old agendas. The president sat at the end of the table with a tired smile. A couple of board members looked like they would rather be anywhere else. I laid out the timeline again, and the documents we had. I emphasized the unknown number, the trespass, the vandalism, and the pattern of escalation. I recommended 3 steps. First, announce a listening session for residents to air concerns with a clear rule that no one would be named or shamed. Second, open the grant applications immediately and pre-approve modest amounts so we could deliver yes answers fast. Third, retain outside counsel to advise the board in case Karen followed through on her threat to sue. That last suggestion made the room go quiet for a beat. The president asked why outside counsel when I was already here. I told him that if my role became part of the dispute, we needed an independent voice to protect the board and to keep conflicts clear. He nodded slowly and said he appreciated the foresight rather than seeing it as a slight. We voted yes on all 3 steps. As we adjourned, a maintenance tech stuck his head in the door and said someone had been in the community storage closet without signing the key log. He had found a bundle of old event stakes missing, the kind used to hold lawn signs. He shrugged like it could be nothing, but his eyes said he was tired of small problems turning into big ones. I thanked him and answered that we would update the lock and send a reminder about key procedures. He left, and the president raised an eyebrow at me. I said I would add the stakes to the list of details that might matter later. When I pulled into my driveway, the sun sat low and flat. A sedan I did not recognize slowed near my curb and then moved on. I noted the plate and texted it to the officer with a quick hello so he knew I was not asking for an emergency response. He replied a minute later saying he would log the plate as part of increased patrol awareness. He added that the city was seeing more neighborhood disputes fueled by online posts and that the best counter was early documentation and calm public meetings. I told him that was exactly what we were doing. I took a short walk to reset my head before the listening session announcement went live. At the corner by the park, I found a new sign on a stake that read, "Project Quiet, speaks tonight," with an address scrawled below for a private home on the next block. I took a photo and checked the posting rules in my head. This had no sponsor name or contact, which made it removable. I slid the sign out of the ground and carried it to the community room for the evidence file. On the way back, I saw 2 more in front yards, where the homeowners probably had not even noticed them yet. I left those and made a note to send a general reminder that unsolicited signs could be discarded. At 6, the HOA email went out with the listening session details. It would be Wednesday in the clubhouse with a moderator from the Neighborhood Mediation Center. We would keep a strict time limit on comments, and no names would be allowed except for introductions. The grant application link went live at the same time. Within minutes, a handful of residents submitted requests for small improvements like door sweeps and weather stripping. I approved the first 3 on the spot and sent friendly notes that said thanks for helping the neighborhood stay considerate. Small wins travel in whispers that do more good than loud declarations. 10 minutes after the email, I received a message from the unknown number that said, "Nice try, counselor." Then a second message followed with a photo of the clubhouse door like a dare. I forwarded both to the officer with a short note. He replied with a plan to have a car near the clubhouse on Wednesday night. He also asked if the board wanted an officer present inside. I said yes if available and that we would cover the community event fee. The evening stretched out with a quiet that made me almost forgive it for being thin as paper. I cooked something simple and ate at the desk while I reviewed the outside council options. By habit, I reached for the pair that had taken us through a tree dispute 2 summers ago. They knew our bylaws, and they knew how to keep tempers from melting the case. I drafted a short engagement letter for review and sent it to the president. He replied with a thumbs up, which is not how lawyers prefer to confirm decisions, but I accepted it because we had at least chosen to move. Just before 9, my new side yard light snapped on. The camera captured the shape of a person crouching by the hedge, looking toward my porch. The face lifted just enough to catch the line of a jaw, and a strand of hair falling from a hood. Not Karen. Younger, maybe late teens or early 20s. The person glanced over their shoulder as if waiting for a signal, then stood and hurried toward the street. A second shape waited near the curb. They walked off together. I felt a twist in my chest. This was not proof of who had thrown the rock at the Hendersons, but it drew a path between the shadows and the campaign without needing a name. I sent the clip to the officer with the plate number I had logged earlier. He thanked me and said he would run the plate for rental status. I called Dan to ask if the street had looked different from his side. He said he had seen 2 kids near my hedge once before and thought they were just cutting through. He asked if I wanted him to point his camera toward my yard. I told him not yet because I did not want to pull more people into this than necessary. He appreciated that and said he had my back anyway. I believed him and felt some part of me unclench. Around 10, the forum lit up with a new thread from someone using their real name this time. It was a neighbor at the far end of the block who said the talk had turned sour and that she did not want to be part of it. She wrote that the music she heard while walking her dog made the evening feel human and that she would rather hear a guitar than a wall of fear. She stopped before naming anyone, but the tone cut straight through the noise. I thanked her privately and reminded myself that courage appears in ordinary sentences when people have had enough. I checked the rental listing again out of habit and saw the calendar had blocked off the next 4 nights, with a note in one review that the host had changed access instructions to a lockbox by the side gate. The photo showed the gate I had passed 100 times with a shadow of the hedge right where my new camera now watched. If Karen's guests were the figures on my feed, it was not because they loved night walks. It was because someone had pointed them through that path. I captured the review before it could vanish and added it to the file. Near midnight, my phone rang with the officer's number. He said the plate belonged to a rental tied to a reservation at an address on our street. He could not disclose the renter's name, but he would contact the company about incidents near the vehicle. He added that a unit could do a walk-by right now. I told him yes and thanked him for staying with this. 2 minutes later, a cruiser rolled by, and the street took a deeper breath. When the lights faded, I wrote out the opening statement I planned to give at the listening session. I kept it short. This community follows rules that protect everyone. We do not target or shame. We solve problems without turning neighbors into enemies. I promised I would stay at the table until the last voice had been heard, and I meant it. Then I wrote a second statement I hoped I would not need. If anyone incites harassment or trespass, the HOA will refer the matter to law enforcement and pursue civil remedies. I slid both statements into a folder. Sleep finally came like a careful guest who knows the host is on edge. I woke to the camera alert and felt my heart kick, but it was just a cat streaking across the yard with a confidence that made me laugh. The sunrise felt honest again. I took that gift and got ready for the day. Today, I would visit the mediation center to confirm our moderator. I would deliver the first grant checks by hand because a neighbor seeing a real envelope does more than an email. I would draft a letter for Karen's attorney, inviting a conversation about compliance and conduct. and I would sit on my porch for 5 minutes with coffee, letting the street be a street, not a courtroom. On the porch, I watched a jogger pass and wave. I waved back. The Hendersons' window glinted with the temporary board, and I pictured the new pane arriving with a clean line that said, "Damage does not get the last word." Karen's curtains were drawn. A delivery truck idled in front of her house with a small box on the porch that could have been anything from a phone charger to a camera. I had to keep my mind from writing stories that fit too neatly. Proof only. Always proof. I dressed for work and checked the clubroom schedule. The listening session sat there like a signpost in the middle of the week. Everything was moving toward it. The campaign would show up. The quiet would show up too. I planned to amplify the second until the first lost the rush that keeps it going. That is how you win real fights. Not with a final blow, but with a series of steady choices that leave fear no room to breathe. I locked my door and stepped into the day ready to make those choices again. By Tuesday, the air in the neighborhood felt charged, like a storm was circling somewhere out of sight. The listening session was tomorrow, and everyone knew it. People waved a little tighter in the morning. Conversations broke off when I walked by. Even the sound of a delivery truck door slamming seemed louder than usual. I started the day at the mediation center to confirm our moderator. A tall man named Stephen, with an easy voice, met me in the lobby and walked me through the setup. He had done sessions for HOAs before and knew the difference between disagreement and a grudge that had turned into identity. I told him to expect the second. He smiled like he had heard that warning many times. We agreed on ground rules: no personal attacks, no naming names, no interruptions, and a timer for each speaker. He would open the meeting, then hand it to me for the board's statement before we moved to comments. Back at my office, I signed the first 3 grant checks and drove them over to the recipients. The second door I knocked on was answered by a woman in her 70s who hugged the envelope to her chest and said she had never expected the HOA to do something so neighborly. I told her that was the point. The third recipient was a young couple who worked opposite shifts. They said the grant would cover new window inserts and maybe even a rug for the living room. I left each stop feeling a little more certain that the quiet majority was still here under the noise. Around noon, Dan came by with his phone in hand. He had caught a new sign going up on a lamppost near the park. This one had a QR code that linked to a poll asking residents to rate how well the HOA handled complaints. The lowest rating had a red frowning face next to the words, "Needs complete overhaul." I scanned the code and took screenshots of the entire poll. Dan said he had pulled the sign down after documenting it. I told him that was fine, but to stay clear of anyone putting them up. The more they thought we were reacting out of anger, the more material they had for their story. In the afternoon, the officer handling our case called with an update. The rental car linked to the plate we had recorded had been returned early that morning. No damage noted. He said he had asked the company to notify him if the same renter booked again. I thanked him and asked if the increased patrol would continue through the listening session. He confirmed and said they would also have a plainclothes officer nearby just in case. I didn't ask what just in case meant. I already knew. Around 3, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject was, "We can help each other." The body said they had information about the person behind the harassment and would be willing to share it if I could guarantee their name stayed out of it. They left no phone number, only a request to meet at the park benches after sunset. Every line in my training told me not to walk into that alone. I forwarded the email to the officer and asked if he could be in the area when I arrived. He agreed without hesitation. At sunset, I walked to the park with a folder under my arm so I looked like I was there for paperwork. The benches were empty at first. Then a man in a baseball cap sat down at the far end and glanced my way. I gave a small nod and waited. He moved closer and said he had stayed in a rental on our street last month. He claimed the host had told him to ignore the HOA rules about parking and guests and to let her know if anyone asked questions. He said he had also seen 2 of her guests walking around at night taking photos of houses. He didn't want to get involved, but when he saw the rock incident on the forum, he thought I should know. I asked if he was willing to give a statement. He said no, but I could use what he told me however I wanted. Then he stood and walked away before I could ask for more. The officer approached from the path and asked if I had gotten anything useful. I told him what the man had said. He took notes and said it lined up with other patterns in similar cases. We agreed it wasn't enough for charges, but it strengthened the context. I walked home under the streetlights, thinking about how some truths arrive half-formed and still manage to change the shape of a case. That night I prepared my statement for the listening session again. I read it out loud until it had no edges that could be mistaken for an attack. I also printed the grant approvals to show that action was already being taken. Proof in hand is harder to argue with than a promise. Just before midnight, the unknown number sent another text. This one said, "Big night tomorrow." I did not respond. I simply saved it to the secure drive. Wednesday morning, the clubhouse smelled faintly of fresh paint from a touch-up the maintenance team had done. I set the chairs in neat rows and placed a sign-in sheet by the door. Stephen arrived early and tested the microphone. The board members filtered in looking like they had each rehearsed their own way to stay calm. At 6:30, the first residents arrived. By 7, the room was full enough that the extra chairs came out. Karen walked in with a stack of papers and 2 people I hadn't seen before. They sat near the front. She didn't look at me. Stephen opened the session with a welcome and the ground rules. Then he handed it to me. I stood and read my statement exactly as I had practiced. I emphasized that the board's role was to ensure fairness and follow the rules we had all agreed to. I mentioned the new grants and thanked the first applicants for helping us strengthen the community. I avoided any mention of individual cases. When I finished, there was a brief silence before the first resident stepped up. The comments started calm enough. A man asked about trimming common area trees. A woman suggested more streetlights. Then a voice from the back said the board wasn't listening to real concerns about noise. Karen stood next. She spoke about sleepless nights and claimed the board had ignored her evidence. She said the community was losing its peace because the board refused to act. Stephen reminded her to keep her comments within the rules. She nodded, but her eyes stayed on me. She finished by saying change was coming whether the board liked it or not. A few more speakers followed with mixed views. Some wanted stricter rules. Others said the neighborhood was fine as it was. Through it all, I kept my notes factual, and my expression even. The last speaker was the neighbor who had posted on the forum about preferring music to fear. She repeated her point with a little more force and ended by saying we should be careful about letting a disagreement turn us into strangers. The room went quiet at that. Stephen thanked everyone and closed the session. As people filed out, Karen brushed past me without a word. One of the people she had brought handed me a flyer that said Project Quiet in bold letters. I took it without comment and slipped it into my folder. Outside, the patrol car was parked by the curb. I gave the officer a quick thumbs up to signal things had stayed peaceful. He nodded but kept watching the crowd until it dispersed. Back at my house, I placed the flyer on the desk next to the grant approvals. 2 different visions of the same neighborhood. One building something, one tearing at it. I chose which side I was going to feed. Then I locked the door and let the quiet settle over the house. For now. Thursday morning felt deceptively normal. The sun was out. A light breeze carried the smell of cut grass. And for a moment I almost believed the listening session had drained some of the tension from the street. Then my phone buzzed with a message from the officer. Someone had filed another anonymous complaint with the city, this time about illegal construction at my address. The inspector was already familiar with our situation and scheduled to come by at noon. I spent the next hour making sure every inch of my property looked as by the book as possible, even though there was nothing to fix. The inspector arrived on time, clipboard in hand, and gave a small smile when he saw me. We walked the yard together, checked the exterior, and stepped into my home office. He shook his head with a quiet chuckle and said, "Again, nothing here violates code." He promised to close the complaint immediately and suggested I start keeping a log of every inspection. I told him I already had one. He gave me his card in case I needed a statement later. After he left, I called the HOA president to update him. He sighed into the phone and said he'd been hearing murmurs about Karen planning something bigger, a petition for a special board election. It wouldn't be easy to pull off, but if she could convince enough residents, she might get the numbers. I asked if he thought she had the support. He hesitated before saying she had a few loud voices and some who would sign anything to make the noise stop, even if it meant siding with her. By late morning, I received another email from the unknown address that had asked to meet in the park. This time it contained a short video clip of a conversation recorded from behind a hedge. The voices were muffled, but I could make out Karen's laugh and the words, "We'll make him resign." The other voice was a man's, unfamiliar, saying, "We'll get the footage tonight." The clip ended abruptly. I saved it to my secure drive, then called the officer. He asked if the voice matched anyone in the neighborhood. I told him no, but that didn't mean much. The city has plenty of people who will do small favors for cash. In the afternoon, I drove to the mediation center to return a folder Stephen had left behind. He thanked me and asked how I thought the session went. I told him it was calmer than I expected, but not over. He nodded, like he had seen the same thing in the faces that didn't speak. He said he'd be available if we needed another meeting. I told him we might, and sooner than we'd like. Back home, I checked the rental listing again. The blocked-off nights had been extended another week. The reviews section now had a new comment from a guest thanking the host for extra privacy. I captured screenshots and added them to the file. That phrase could mean nothing, or it could be code for looking the other way. Around 4, Dan knocked on my door. He'd been walking his dog and saw 2 people standing by the Hendersons' fence, pointing toward the new glass. When they noticed him, they walked off quickly toward the park. He said he didn't recognize them. I checked my cameras and caught the same pair from the other, night-hooded, heads down, moving like they didn't want to be seen. I sent the images to the officer, who replied almost immediately, saying he'd have a unit sweep the park area. Evening came with a strange stillness. No knocks, no messages, no movement near the hedges. I sat at my desk, working through client contracts, when the quiet cracked. My side yard light flashed on, and the camera feed showed a single figure not moving, just standing there with something in their hand. The image wasn't perfect, but I could see the outline of a phone pointed toward my window. I called it in while keeping the feed open. The person turned, walked into the street, and disappeared behind a parked SUV. The patrol car arrived within minutes. The officer walked the area but found no one. He suggested I install a small motion alarm that would make lingering less comfortable for trespassers. I told him I'd get one tomorrow. He also mentioned that they were looking into linking the rental listing to any open disturbance reports in the city database. If they found a match, it could give us leverage. Later that night, I checked the community forum. A new post had gone up from Karen, accusing the board of hiding behind police protection and calling the grants bribes to keep people quiet. She hinted that the truth about my role would come out soon. I didn't reply. Sometimes silence makes the noise lose its shape. Instead, I printed the post and slid it into my file. Near midnight, the unknown number texted again. "Hope you're ready." No punctuation, no emoji, just the same directness that had been there from the start. I put the phone down without replying, closed the blinds, and sat in the dark for a moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of leaves outside. I knew the pattern by now. This wasn't random. This was a build-up, and whatever was coming next would aim to push me past my own line. Friday started with rain that blurred the street into streaks of grey and turned every sound into a dull echo. I sat by the window with coffee, watching drops gather on the edge of the new side yard light and slide off in heavy beads. The stillness made it tempting to believe nothing would happen today, but the file on my desk told me better. The officer had texted before sunrise saying they had run the voices in that video clip through their system without a match. I didn't expect one. Some things stay just out of reach until someone decides to talk. Around 9, the HOA president called. He'd received word that Karen was planning a Saturday meeting at her house for supporters of Project Quiet. It was being pitched as an informal gathering, but the goal was clearly to sign people onto her petition for a special election. I asked how many signatures she needed. He said 20% of the membership. If she got them, we'd be required to hold a vote. That wouldn't mean she'd win, but it would keep the neighborhood in turmoil for weeks. I told him we needed to keep the grants moving and the communication steady, so people saw the board as active and reasonable. He agreed. By late morning, the rain eased to a mist, and I decided to check the park area where the 2 hooded figures had been spotted. The grass was still wet under my shoes, and the air smelled of damp earth. Near the far fence, I found the remains of a flyer that had disintegrated in the weather. The words Project Quiet were still visible, along with a blurred QR code. I took a photo for the record. As I walked back, a sedan slowed beside me. The passenger window rolled down halfway, but no one spoke. I looked at the driver, then the passenger, both unfamiliar. The car moved on without a word. Back home, I installed the small motion alarm, the officer suggested. It was loud enough to make lingering uncomfortable, but not so loud it would wake the whole block. I tested it twice, watching the camera feed each time. The sound made even me step back. That was the point. In the afternoon, Dan stopped by to tell me a rumor was spreading that the board was going to fine anyone who hosted guests for more than a week. He asked if it was true. I told him no, and asked where he'd heard it. He said a neighbor down the street had repeated it after speaking to someone at Karen's place. I wrote it down as another example of how fast misinformation can move when there's no counter to it. I decided to post a short note on the forum, clarifying the actual guest policy. No names, no accusations, just facts. Evening came with a strange quiet again, the kind that feels like the moment before a curtain rises. I was working through a stack of contracts when my phone buzzed with a motion alert. The camera showed a single envelope slid under my front door. I opened it to find a single sheet of paper with cut-out letters spelling, "Resign now." No signature, no return address. The childishness of it almost made me laugh, but the fact that someone had walked up to my door to deliver it tightened my jaw. I called the officer and he sent a patrol to collect it for prints, even though we both knew gloves were likely involved. Not long after, the unknown number texted, "Tomorrow changes everything." I didn't reply. I saved the message and forwarded it to the officer. He said they'd keep extra patrols tomorrow and advised me to avoid being alone outside after dark. I agreed. Just before midnight, I checked the rental listing again. The booking calendar had been cleared for the next 2 weeks, with a note saying, "Special guest arrangements in place." I captured screenshots of every page. If Karen's meeting tomorrow was bringing in out-of-town allies, it could explain the change. I shut down my laptop and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the rain return in a soft patter. The sound felt clean in a week that had been anything but. Tomorrow would bring movement, maybe confrontation, and I needed to be ready to meet it without losing my footing. Whatever happened, I wanted my side of the record to stay steady, measured, and undeniable. Saturday arrived with a bright, thin sun that made everything look sharper than it felt. I stepped onto the porch with coffee and watched the street wake up. A jogger went by. A kid on a scooter made a loop around the cul-de-sac and vanished. Across the way, the Hendersons opened their curtains and stood for a second in the warm square of light like they were checking the day for danger. My phone buzzed with a message from the officer. Extra patrols confirmed. He added that if anything at Karen's house looked like a public event, I should document it. He did not tell me to stay away. He knew I would not. By mid-morning, cars began to trickle into the neighborhood that I did not recognize. Not a flood, just a steady set of arrivals like beads on a string. They parked along the curb near Karen's driveway and by the park. People carried covered trays and stacks of flyers and a few folded chairs. From my porch, I could see the side gate to Karen's yard standing open with a small sign taped to it that said, "Welcome," in letters neat enough to look printed. The same gate that held the lockbox in that review. I took a few photos from my front walk and kept the timestamp clear in frame, then went inside to write a short note to the board. Event underway. Will attend briefly as observer. Security visible. Just after noon, I walked down the sidewalk with my notebook in my pocket and a steady breath. As I came up to the driveway, a woman with a clipboard stepped in front of me and asked for my name. I gave it and waited. She scanned a list and then looked up at me with a tight smile. She said guests only. I told her I was a resident and the HOA's attorney. I added that I was here on public sidewalk space to observe compliance with community rules regarding gatherings. She hesitated, then stood to the side without inviting me in. That was fine. I did not need a plate of cookies. I needed the scene. From the sidewalk, I could see the backyard trimmed like a magazine spread. A canopy tent had been set near the patio with a long table under it and a stack of branded flyers on top. Project Quiet was printed across the top in heavy type. A chalkboard leaned near the sliding door with a schedule written in careful lines. Introduction, testimonies, petition, action teams. My jaw tensed at that last line. Karen stood near the table in a blue blouse and a smile that belonged to a ribbon cutting. She welcomed a couple who handed over a dessert plate and then turned to a cluster of people I recognized from around the block. She saw me and the smile held while her eyes changed. She came to the fence and said, "Good afternoon," like we were old friends. I told her I was here in my official capacity and would remain on the public side of the property. She said of course, and that she hoped I would listen to the community's real concerns. I told her I had been listening since the first complaint and that I would keep listening now. The introductions began with her voice pitched just loud enough to reach the sidewalk. She spoke of peace and neighborliness, and then of threats to both. She did not say the Hendersons' name, but she looked toward their house, and a ripple of attention followed her gaze. She spoke about a board that had forgotten its duty. She kept her hands open like she was offering something. A man I had not seen before took the chalkboard and pointed to the word petition. He explained the special election process as if it were a rescue plan. He asked for signatures after testimonies. The first testimony came from a woman who said she could not watch television some evenings without turning it up. She did not mention whose house produced the sound. The second came from a man who admitted he worked nights and slept during the day and disliked leaf blowers. The third was a visitor who said she stayed on our street for a weekend last month and found the nights too lively. I leaned in at that. A visitor. She described walking in the evening and being startled by a sudden burst of laughter from an open garage. She said the neighborhood felt busy. Karen thanked her warmly and squeezed her shoulder like she had proven a point. I wrote everything in my notebook with times and short phrases that would make sense later. When the petition clipboards came out, a few neighbors stepped forward. Many did not. Some looked uncomfortable. Some looked afraid of being seen, not signing. I kept my face neutral and took pictures of the clipboards from the sidewalk without capturing names, just the act of collecting. I also took a photo of a small box near the patio labeled donations. That was new. If funds were being collected in the name of a community program, there were laws to follow. A man with a camera phone moved to the fence and aimed it at me. He asked if I was recording people without permission. I said I was documenting a public event from public space and that anyone was free to do the same. He filmed my face for a long 3 seconds as if trying to get a reaction, then walked back to the patio. After an hour, I turned to leave. That was when I heard the word lawyer hissed from the side yard like a challenge. A young man in a hoodie stepped out from behind a hedge and blocked the sidewalk for a second, then stepped aside. I recognized the shape from my night footage. He looked me up and down and smiled without warmth. He said, "Enjoy the show." I told him the show would end with rules. He laughed and walked past me toward the open gate. I recorded the time and the face and kept moving. Back home, I sent the officer a brief update. He replied that a unit had driven by and had seen no violations yet but would return later in the day. He asked if I had noticed any alcohol service. I said yes, there were open bottles on the table. He thanked me and noted it. The afternoon wound forward with a kind of slow pull. Cars came and went. The rain from yesterday left the air soft and heavy. I heard clapping once, then laughter, then nothing for a while. At 5, my doorbell rang. Dan stood there with a face that told me he had pushed past his comfort zone. He said he had walked by and seen the petition with 15 names. He had also heard someone inside talk about getting a video tonight that would force the board's hand. I asked what kind of video. He said he did not know, only that the words "catch him" were used. He looked at me and asked if I had anyone I could call to be with me tonight. I thanked him for the care and told him the patrol was aware. He shook his head and said awareness was not the same as presence. I told him I would be careful. As dusk settled, my side yard light clicked on and off with passing shadows from branches. I closed the curtains in my office and set my camera feeds to a larger display. I checked that the motion alarm was armed. I laid my notes in order on the desk and placed the envelope with the cut-out letters next to them like a reminder of how small the tactics could look when the plan was to make them feel big. At 8, the unknown number texted, "Tonight is the night." A second message followed. "Check the forum in 10. I set a timer on my phone and waited. 10 minutes later, a new thread appeared from an account created that hour. It claimed to have proof the HOA attorney was intimidating residents and suppressing speech. It said a video would post at 10. I took screenshots and alerted the admin to preserve logs. Then I typed a single line from the HOA account. "The board encourages anyone with relevant information to contact us directly. We will review any credible evidence." I posted it and closed the window. 9:30 brought a knock at my door that was too light to be a neighbor and too late to be a delivery. I did not open it. I checked the camera instead. The lens showed a young woman in a hoodie with her hands in her pockets staring at the door like she was listening to the house breathe. After a moment, she slid a small flash drive in a clear bag under the doormat and walked away without looking back. I waited until she was out of frame, then opened the door and picked up the bag with a paper towel. I shut the door and carried it to my desk. My chest had the tight drumbeat that tells you a moment is about to try to define you. I booted a clean laptop, not connected to the home network, and plugged in the drive. The folder held 2 files. The first was a short clip of me speaking at the listening session, edited so that my line about referring harassment to law enforcement sounded like a threat aimed at Karen personally. The second was an empty text file named Confession. I sat still while the anger rose, then fell. This was not truth. This was bait. I copied the files to the analysis folder and ejected the drive. I placed it in a plastic sleeve and labeled it with the time. Then I called the officer and described the drop. He said he would pick it up for evidence and suggested I not engage online until they had reviewed it. I agreed. 10 o'clock hit. The promised video posted to the forum. It was the edited clip with a caption that called me a bully. Comments lit up. Half were cautious. A quarter were angry. A few asked for the full recording, which we had. I messaged the admin and requested permission to post the full unedited session video from the Mediation Center archive. He verified the request and approved it. I uploaded the full file with a short note. For transparency, the entire session is attached. No edits, no cuts. Watch and decide. Then I stepped away from the screen. Outside, a car door slammed. My side yard camera flashed. 2 figures moved along the hedge toward the porch. The motion alarm chirped loudly, and they flinched but kept going. One held a phone up toward my window. The other reached to my doormat and lifted it like they were checking for something else. I called the officer on speaker while watching the feed. He said units were close. The figures placed a second envelope at the edge of the mat and stepped back toward the street. That was when a voice from across the way called out, "Dan." He told them they were on camera and that the police were on the way. The figures turned and ran. A cruiser rounded the corner moments later. The officer retrieved the envelope with gloves, while another unit rolled past Karen's house. I stood on the porch with a calm I had to manufacture. The envelope contained printed screenshots of the edited video with red circles around my face. No words, no threats, just implication. The officer shook his head and said the pattern was clear. He asked if I would be willing to sign a statement to support a harassment order if they identified the people in the footage. I said yes. He also told me something else. An unmarked car had observed cash changing hands behind Karen's fence earlier in the evening. It could have been donations for the petition. It could have been something else. They would follow up. After the cars left and the street calmed, I sat at my desk and opened the forum again. The full video had started to turn the comments. People who had been on the fence saw the difference between what I said and how it had been cut. A neighbor who rarely posted wrote that the edit felt wrong and that whoever had shared it owed the community honesty. I felt my shoulders lower by a fraction. Truth moves slower than rumor, but it travels. Near midnight, my phone buzzed one more time. The unknown number again. Not a threat this time. A single sentence. "She is lying to them." I typed who and stopped. I looked out the window toward Karen's house, where the canopy tent still stood in the dark like a leftover prop. I put the phone down without replying and wrote the sentence in my notes. Then I added the day's last entry. Tomorrow the board acts. Not with anger, with law. Sunday started with a clear sky that felt too clean for what I knew had to happen. I poured coffee and read through my notes one last time. The pages thick with timestamps, quotes, photos, and clips. The officer had texted just after dawn saying they'd made progress identifying the 2 figures from the porch video. The rental company had confirmed the guest names and one of them matched the young man in the hoodie from Karen's gathering. That was the thread we needed to start pulling. The HOA president called before 8. His voice was tight but steady. He said the board was ready to take formal action. We would deliver a notice to Karen today citing violation of the rental policy, failure to register, and conduct that created a hostile environment for other residents. The notice would include a deadline for compliance and a warning that continued violations could result in fines and legal action. I told him I'd draft it within the hour and suggested we deliver it in person with at least 2 board members present. He agreed. By mid-morning, the letter was printed, signed, and sealed in an envelope with the HOA stamp. The president and I met at the community room where 2 other board members joined us. They didn't look eager, but they understood the need. I read the letter aloud so everyone knew exactly what we were about to hand her. No accusations about the harassment, yet just the violations we could prove beyond any doubt. The rest would come once law enforcement finished their work. We walked together down the street. Karen's house sat quiet, the canopy tent from yesterday still folded on the side of the driveway. A car I didn't recognize was parked out front. The president knocked firmly. After a pause, Karen opened the door wearing a neutral expression that didn't match the sharpness in her eyes. The president introduced us all and handed her the envelope. She took it without looking down, then asked if this was about the petition. I told her it was about documented violations of HOA policy, and that she had until the date stated in the letter to comply. She said she'd be speaking to her attorney and tried to close the door. The president reminded her that failure to respond could lead to legal action. She said we'd hear from her lawyer. The door shut. As we walked away, one of the board members exhaled like he'd been holding it since the knock. The president said quietly that the hard part would be the waiting now. I agreed, but I also knew that the waiting might not be long. Karen didn't like to be on defense. She would push back fast. Back at my house, I sat on the porch with my laptop and uploaded the full package of evidence to a secure folder for the officer and the board. I included the rental listing screenshots, the guest review about extra privacy, the lockbox photo, the gathering photos, the donation box, and the porch incident videos. I labeled each piece clearly so no one had to guess at its relevance. Around noon, Dan stopped by with 2 coffees. He said the street felt tense this morning. People were glancing at each other more than usual, checking who was talking to whom. He asked if he should expect more late-night activity. I told him I hoped not, but to keep his cameras rolling just in case. He nodded and said he was glad the board was acting before the whole thing spun any further. Early afternoon brought the call I'd been expecting. A man introduced himself as Karen's attorney. His tone was polite but firm. He said his client disputed the violations and viewed the notice as retaliation for her noise complaint. I told him the violations were unrelated to any complaint and based solely on documented facts and HOA bylaws. I offered to send him the evidence packet. He hesitated, then said he'd review anything I sent, but that Karen was prepared to defend her position. I told him she had that right, and that we would follow the process exactly as written. We ended the call without raising our voices. By late afternoon, the officer came by in person. He had news. The 2 identified guests had admitted to walking around at night taking photos of houses. They claimed Karen had asked them to gather proof of HOA bias. He said that in doing so they had trespassed multiple times, and that charges were possible if the homeowners wanted to pursue them. The Hendersons were willing. He would be drafting the reports that evening. He also told me the cash exchange at Karen's fence was likely related to the petition event, but they were still looking into whether any fundraising rules had been violated. Evening came with a slower light, the kind that makes you think the day might end without another shift. I was halfway through dinner when the unknown number texted again. This time it said only, "She didn't tell them about the guests before you." I read it twice, then forwarded it to the officer. He replied, "I think we're close." After dark, the patrol car made its usual pass, spotlight gliding over the hedges. The street looked quiet. My cameras stayed still. No movement in the side yard, no figures on the porch. Just the hum of a normal night. I sat at my desk and started drafting the next communication for the border summary to send to all residents, explaining the rental policy in plain language, the grant program's early results, and the importance of keeping disputes within the established process. The tone would be calm, steady, and unshakable. At 10, I stepped outside one last time. The air was cool. Somewhere down the street, a screen door closed. The Hendersons' new window caught the porch light and threw it back clean and clear. I thought about the line from my notes. Tomorrow the board acts. We had acted. Now it was about holding our ground and letting the proof speak louder than the noise. I turned off the porch light, locked the door, and left the cameras running. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, the street felt like it might remember how to be just a street again.